Thank you very much. Is this part of the machine on? Because I like to wander. So, hearing me when I'm wandering? Yes? Good. Okay. Thank you very much for those kind remarks. And you have no idea what a pleasure it is for me to be here. I've wanted to come back to the Philippines ever since I spent 2 wonderful years with my wife Nancy and 4 kids when I was just a little boy with a fresh PhD from Stanford in 1967-68. And I was able to do it only once to a bank conference. And so I'm just so tickled to be here and to make a lot of connections again with all my friends from that time. So I really appreciate the opportunity. Okay, so let us proceed. I'm a little intimidated, I must say, because it says in the advertisement, and this must be fair advertising, that this lecture will go on until 6:30. There is no way I'm going to go on until 6:30. So if you've already paid your money at the door, you may ask for your money back, because I won't be able to go on for 2.5 hours. I won't be able to go on for 2 hours. But I do have some things to say, and so let's start on them. As you can see, the title is Trade and Poverty, When the Third World Fell Behind. When I'm up close to this mic, I can hear it, and I get over here, and I can't. So I need reassurance that that's working.
Okay, go.
Yes? Aha! Bingo. Okay. All right, now we can proceed. We have the technology in place. First, I just want to, with that bounce, note the email address. Some of you may be annoyed by what I say this afternoon, or stimulated perhaps, and I urge you to make a note of my email address, and if you want to pursue this conversation through emails and you're unable to return to a second event, there it is. I also hope AIM won't mind, but Pepe Encarnacion was a very big part of my life when I was here in 67, 68, and we all miss him, I'm sure, and so this is for Pepe. I hope he's not embarrassed by it. Let me begin with an advertisement. This is based on a book of mine that's just come out at MIT Press, and I've seen a copy of it in the room, so it really exists. And I really want you to buy it now. So if you walk out the room and you find this interesting argument, then go buy it or wait for the paperback version. And I'm sure it'll be available at Amazon.com soon. So there you are. Here's the motivation. Economists for a long time, ever since Adam Smith, but for the past 2 decades in particular, economists who thought that exploring the impact of culture and institutions on performance was really for sociologists. Economics and economists had no business doing it because the paradigms that were being used, the models and the economics being applied, were too vague and fuzzy to deal with issues that important. Well, over the past 2 decades, that's all changed. And now the empirical work and the theoretical work and the applied work has just been immense and very, very informative. The key issue, which was one of Adam Smith's key issues, is explaining the economic distance, the wide economic gulf between what we might call North and South, or what we might call the rich core and the poor periphery, and so on. And what its origins were, when did it appear, how dramatically did it appear, and when, and what were the causes. So that was my friend and colleague David Landis's focus, and when he was writing in 1998, and the subsequent 2 decades worth of outpouring has dealt with that question. The competing explanations deal with what we call fundamentals. I mean, the real serious stuff, not monetary policy or exchange rate management, but the really serious fundamentals. Basically, there are 3 competitors out there. Culture, which was David Landis's hypothesis and commitment, goes back to Polanyi, writing during World War II, and has recently been manifested in another book by an economic historian. David is an economic historian, and Greg Clark is an economic historian. In Greg's book in 2007, these guys are pushing culture. Now, I don't know where you fit corruption and poor government and bad leadership, words that I hear often when people are talking about disappointing Philippine performance over the past quarter century, but it might fit in culture, that it's kind of the culture of the place that yields those kinds of, that kind of growth performance, disappointing growth performance. Second competitor is geography, and certainly the Philippines never suffered by that endowment. And that's pushed by Jared Diamond, Jeff Sachs, and Easterly and Levine, and others. But they all argue the endowment of geography will really matter. If you're surrounded by seas and your main population is close to the coast, you gain immense advantages as a result, as did England and as the Philippines should have. Sachs has argued disease and disease environments in Africa matter, and so on. But these others have argued that the endowments of natural resources and minerals will determine what commodities you specialize in, and that these conditions will influence the way you perform in the aggregate. So there's a second competitor. The third one is institutions. And one of these guys won a Nobel Prize for making these arguments over and over and better, and that's Doug North. But there's a sequence of others that I'm going to talk about later. But the second pair is, again, economic historians, Stan Engerman and Ken Sokoloff, 2 economic historians focusing mainly on Latin America, another disappointing performer. And then AJR, Asimoglu, Johnson, and Robinson with amazing work that they have been doing. So these are the 3 competitors in accounting for differences in performance, growth performance in the very long run, and therefore in the opening up of gaps between the poor periphery, Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Europe and its offshoots. I don't know whether you know this literature, but I sent this PowerPoint over to AIM some time ago, and they assured me it was at some website somewhere. Now, the students that are in the back, have you noticed that it's at some website accessible to you? No? We got to fix this. Because you don't want to write all these down. They're available somewhere. And if they're not on a website now, we'll make sure that they are so that you can pursue these contributions if you're unfamiliar with them. So there's the AJR guys, and there's Greg Clark's book, and there's Jared Diamond's work, and there's Easterly and Engerman and Sokoloff and Landis and North and so on and so forth. So those are the folks that I'm referring to. I hope, by the way, though I'm an economic historian, I'm really not interested in a historical question unless it speaks to a contemporary issue and informs a current debate. So I am hopeful that these remarks will provoke a focused conversation about what could account for the disappointing performance of the Philippine economy over the past quarter century compared to the rest of Asia. So I will be returning that issue a number of times, but on the sixth lecture, March 17, I guess, I will speak only half the time, and then there will be a panel that will speak the rest of the time about this issue. And we'll see whether these remarks by an economic historian are helpful in focusing on these debates. The problem with these three contenders, culture, institutions, and geography, and those fundamentals, is that fundamentals don't change very much over time. And again, using the Philippine example, I'm going to show you on March 17, if the panel gives me 3 or 4 minutes to do it, before they start telling you the truth, I'm going to show you evidence that shows that Philippines has performed extremely well by any comparative measure you like from 1800 to 1975. It's since then that things have gone sour. So if it's culture, institutions, or geography, what explains the change and a reversal in changes that would account for the more disappointing performance of late? But the problem is, therefore, that if you're interested in long-run growth and observe a variety of growth performances across countries and over time, but the geography doesn't change very much, culture is slow to change, and so are institutions, how do you account for pretty dramatic changes in economic performance? In particular, what explains the timing and the magnitude of what we call the Great Divergence? The Great Divergence between Asia and Africa and to some extent Latin America and the rest, the leaders, Europe and their offshoots, in particular the English-speaking offshoots. And why is it that the gap opened up so dramatically across what we call the long 19th century, from 1800 up to World War I? That's when most of it was done. I mean, by 1950 and 1960, it had already been done. The conditions that created the great gaps in GDP per capita and living standards and all the rest, that experience had already taken place. So if we're looking for sources, you don't want to look at 1970, you don't want to look at 1950, you don't want to look at the interwar period, you want to look at the 19th century, because that's where it appeared. Now, there's one possible explanation that those three fundamentals, culture, institutions, and geography, don't cover. There's one additional explanation which does undergo dramatic change and might therefore be a possible contender of the Great Divergence. I've forgotten which the third lecture, I guess, I'm going to talk about globalization and the globalization and inequality connection. And we'll talk more about this issue. But forget all your history that you were taught in elementary school and high school. It is not true that after Columbus and da Gama that the world became a global place. Absolutely not. That sounds like an outrageous assertion. There were Dutch and Brits and Chinese all over the Philippines at this time. By that, what I mean is trade. I'm not talking about the transfer of disease. I'm not talking about the transfer of technology. I'm talking about trade and the size of that trade and the impact of trade on the trading parties. Under that condition, from 1492 to 1800, the world was a closed place. It was an anti-global place.